Thanks so much for listening to What the Heck is Happening in HR today. We're going to talk about non-competes and what the heck is happening with the Federal Trade Commission. For our podcast disclaimer, please visit the episode description. Yes, it's the Federal Trade Commission on what the heck is happening in HR. Now, remember, I'm not an attorney, and you should chat with your employment lawyer about this. I just want to let you know what I have heard and what I have read from the smart lawyers I follow. And I also had this as a request. I got an email from someone who said, hey, why don't you do something about the FTC and what they're doing with non-competes? I listen to you every week, and I really want to know what's going on. There's too much out there. So let's talk about it. So first of all, what's the FTC? The Federal Trade Commission was set up back in 1915 by President Wilson, and the whole purpose of it was to make sure we didn't have unfair methods of competition. So this is a lot of times you hear about the FTC when they broke up the Bell programs. All the baby bells happened. That's when we had one big telephone company. You might have heard about them being involved when there were some mergers around cable companies or around cell phone companies, or even on the baseball agreements and football agreements. That's all around whether is there a monopoly or not, and is there unfair competition, and do we need to put some regulations in place? That's why it exists. So what's the fuss about non-competes? And let's talk about non-competes and what they are. Non-competes say, hey, if you leave us, you can't go work for somebody else that's in the same business we're in. Now, there are stipulations around that. Sometimes it's the very same business. You can't go work in radio, and we're in radio. Or you can work in TV, but you can't work in radio. It could be you can't work in radio within 100 miles or within the same market. Those are ways for people to be able to recapture the customers who they may have lost because of that person leaving. Sometimes companies have non-competes so that people aren't taking the trade secrets, which is a different thing, but it's really about the relationships. So they might not want them to move the relationship over to the new company. But the thing with non-competes is they got kind of out of hand. There were sandwich shops who were telling people that they couldn't work for any company that had made a sandwich with at least 10% of their businesses being sandwiches within 20 miles. Well, come on. I mean, if I'm making sandwiches and if I'm 16, 17 years old, I'm making sandwiches at a place and now I'm going to another place because they just opened. Really, I'm signing a non-compete about that? So, yeah, in some place it probably did get out of hand. So what did the FTC do about all this? So they have proposed what they consider a final non-compete clause or a final ruling. And so what happens is the ruling gets published in the Federal Register, and then 120 days from that is when it goes into effect. So they said that there can be no non-competes. I know that's a double negative, but you can't have non-competes for the majority of the workforce. Period. That's it. They see it as opening up the ability for people to work where they want to work and how they want to work. Now, they do have something in there that says existing non-competes can be enforced for senior executives only. So who's a senior executive? Now, those of you in HR, you're like, oh, is that the same as the highly compensated that we cover under Fair Labor Standards Act? Of course not. That would be way too easy. So instead, they're saying, senior executives who make more than $151,164, perhaps are in a policy-making position. So anything like that, like the CEO or an officer, then they would need to and could still be under their existing non-compete. But otherwise, there will be no new non-competes, and the other non-competes for the rest of the people who had one, who are not under that senior executive part, that will be eliminated. So, what are you going to do? You need to figure out who could be considered an executive, who's in that policy-making way. You've got to figure out who needs to be provided a notice. You need to figure out what is happening with the language of any agreements you do have. And that would include things like a provision that would say, hey, if one part of this agreement gets thrown out, the rest of the provisions stay the same. But here's the big but. Less than 24 hours after this final rule was published, lawsuits were filed. And they are saying that the scope and the breadth of this is outrageous. They are saying that the FTC, they being the Chamber of Commerce, and well as several states, are saying that it is exceeding its authority. And they're saying that this is not unusual. This happened back when OSHA tried to require large employers to have everybody vaccinated. And that was overreaching, and that this is really more legislative and is not part of the FTC at all. They're saying it's an overstep and that they can't regulate the relationship between employees and employers, and that agencies are actually barred from doing that over some other court cases, other doctrines that are in place. So it's up in the air still now. There's lawsuits out there, but meanwhile, the 120 days is counting. So if you're a business owner, speak with your employment attorney. If you don't have one, reach out to me. I will be happy to let you interview several of them so you can find one that gets you. And also, you want to be able to find out who's an executive and what are you going to do about your existing ones, and how are you going to notify people whether they're still under them or not. That's a lot to do about one rule that's happening, or maybe not, and what phase it will be happening in. So what we do know is the phase we're in on Monday mornings is to listen to the latest podcast here on What the Heck is Happening in HR. We'll see you then.